When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, and welcome back to the Grease Comedy YouTube channel. In today's video, we are going to be looking at my top 10 deaths within A Song of Ice and Fire. This will be based off of the books, not the show, so some people may have a different list when you're looking at the show versus the book series. But before we get into the video, if you guys like to like, subscribe, and comment, please do. It helps the channel grow, reach our people that might like this content as well. And let's get into it. So, first off, this is not the perfect list. It's not the right list. You guys are going to probably have very different opinions. There's a couple characters on here that I think in my honorable mention, you could very much argue for one of the spots in my top 10, especially depending on how Winds of Winter goes with one of these characters that we'll talk about on the list. But I want to start off by making my intentions clear on how I ranked these characters. Now, for me, I ranked it on impact on the story. So, how did their death affect the story? How did it drive and create new plot lines and its impact on characters in the world? Right? So that's number one. Number two is, how did they die? What was the spectacle around it? Was it a really awesome death? It's really unique. Was it interesting? And there's a couple that are going to be in this main category that I'm going to talk about that go along with that and kind of the impact. So those are kind of two of the main things that I'm looking at when ranking these deaths. A third thing is, did it make sense logically in the story? Was it foreshadowed? Did it make sense, right? So there's some things in the show where a character like Varys would die in the last season, but it didn't really feel earned or feel right. So that's another thing I took into account in the ranking. With that being said, there are 277 named characters that are killed. So, again, this is not the correct list, but it is mine, right? Give me your guys' list down below. I did my best. I tried to go through every character that ended up, dying that we know of. Credit to, the World of Ice and Fire wiki. I got this from that. So if you guys wanted to check that out, I would, feel free to gauge all the deaths. So first of all, we're going to talk about a couple of my honorable mentions because there's a lot of characters that I feel like should be named in here that just did not make the list. So I'm not going to talk a ton about them, but Ygritte's death, it's not the most impactful when you look at the kingdoms or anything like that, which is the reason it's not on the list. It's kind of holding it back. But the pure emotional toll, right, and the tragedy that is her death and seeing her last moments with Jon, which is, in my opinion, probably the best love relationship within the entire book series, or it's at least up there. The sheer weight that was on that chapter and the way it kind of ends and how Ygritte dies, it deserved to be told. Now, Renly's is almost the opposite. Renly's had a huge impact. He was one of probably the most powerful of the Five Kings at the time. His death greatly impacts the story by giving Stannis more power, and also giving the Lannisters more power to, again, eventually ally with the Tyrells. So Renly, to me, had all of that, but he didn't really have the emotional weight. Renly is not a character that we get much of, but we know he's a very important character. Other characters, Quentin, another character where it's like, it was a cool death the way he goes out, but again, when you look at the story, I wouldn't say it was the most impactful when you look at the characters I have in my top 10. Also, I don't believe he was really a fan favorite or anything around that, so I think his death wasn't as impactful as a lot of the other deaths. Mirri Maz Duur is a really difficult one because her death is kind of a really awesome spectacle where she ends up kind of, dying to bring forth the dragons. But at the same time, not a huge character within the story. And I also have, another character on here that's going to be involved in the Daenerys plotline that I think has more impact than she did. Cresson, I think this is really an impactful death showing and introducing us into Stannis' camp and the power of R'hllor as a whole. So I think a very impactful death when it comes to that aspect of it narratively. But not a ton of emotional weight there. The Tickler. Again, it's a lot of these deaths that you see outside of the top 10 have one thing going, but not the other. The Tickler, we see a lot of emotion and a lot of, it kind of starts and almost concludes Arya's kind of goal, right? Where she's starting to eventually get vengeance and stuff like that, and she's taking her, her anger out. The Tickler is one, right? So the Tickler gets repeatedly stabbed by Arya, but again, not a hugely impactful kill when you look at the whole world, really. So that is kind of why he's not on there. Lysa is a really interesting one. I think Lysa would be one of the ones on here that I would possibly look to maybe move in here if I was watching it, as a viewer, because Lysa has a really cool death. It's a pretty impactful death as it puts Littlefinger kind of in sole possession and leadership. But the reason I think I don't put it as high is because I feel like Littlefinger kind of already had that power. It's just he gets Lysa out of the way, which is kind of a liability. So I think on that idea, I wouldn't put Lysa especially ahead of a lot of the characters on the list. Merritt Frey, and then I'll also, do Kevin Lannister in this as well, and we'll also say Khal Drogo. A lot of those deaths were either, very kind of impact or an emotional kind of deaths that were interesting, or other ones were just kind of impactful. Like Kevin Lannister is very impactful, but again, we don't see a ton of him, so it's like you can't really argue. I think those type of characters getting moved forward. Khal's a really interesting one. Khal's another one I would think about throwing on this list, but I wouldn't say it's a tough one because it kind of concludes Daenerys' arc in book 1, and it is very impactful because you see Daenerys kind of grow and kind of take over the leadership. But at the same time, it's not as impactful, in my opinion, as a lot of the other ones. So getting now into the top 10. I'm sorry it took so long to get into the top 10, but there's a lot of characters that I think deserve some kind of, acknowledgement. And some other ones we talk about would be Lewin or even Mace Draymond, but again, don't have them on the list. So number 10 is going to be Will. This is actually the second death we ever see in the entirety of A Game of Thrones. And this is actually really impactful because, one, it introduces us into the main threat, being the others. Two, it's not only that, but it's also extremely emotional because he gets strangled by his companion, Waymar Royce, who gets killed a little bit before that. So not only do you have a really interesting death and a spectacular one when you really look at it, well, not for Will, but you also have a very impactful death, right? This is something that Garrett is kind of going to keep to himself and end up telling like Eddard and stuff like that before he gets beheaded. It's something that to me is a very strong death that has to be on the list for just its sheer impact when you look at as us as a reader getting into who is the big threat. And it's something we still theorize on that chapter of what the others are up to because we don't see much of them. So to me, I think that is one of the biggest deaths in the series, and I think it had to be above some of the other ones on the list. Now, getting into number 9, this is going to be Robert Baratheon. Now, this one's a tough one because Robert Baratheon's death is probably one of the most impactful on this entire list. But, there is a but. His death is a kind of one where it's like we don't see it, right? We do see him actually dying basically, but we don't see the boar fight or anything like that. So I feel like when you look at spectacle with, I think, every character on this list where we actually see their actual death, I think Robert does get held down because we kind of hear of it, right? It's not like we're in the head of someone while this happens. This would have been interesting if we got like a Renly, maybe POV, when Robert was, hunting or something. Or even Barristan, getting a POV into Robert when he was hunting, so we could have actually seen what happened. But that whole idea, I think, is what brings it down a bit. But you can't even, say, it doesn't have a big impact, right? I think Robert, I would say you could really say he is probably in the top 3 to 4 on impact alone, but the emotional weight for me isn't there because Robert's not like anyone's favorite character, really. He's a really great character, and in the books, I think he's not as loved as he was on the TV show. I think the TV show made him a lot more loved because we saw more of him. We saw a lot of scenes in the show that weren't in the books that really helped Robert's character. So for me, I have Robert down at number 9, but I definitely think you could argue for him being higher. Number 8. This is going to be Viserys. So Viserys, again, I said there was going to be one for Daenerys's kind of plot in book 1, and this is it. It's hugely impactful. One of the last Targaryens being killed. We finally see Daenerys break free of Viserys' grip, and this is where I would really say Daenerys, we start to see her arc, and it's been leading up to this whole idea of Daenerys growing confident, becoming kind of the person she needs to be, and it's crowned off with probably the coolest death within the entire book series, with the gold crown basically that basically like melts basically Viserys. And I think it's a really awesome death because we see how Daenerys, how ruthless she is becoming towards people that do her harm or do anything negative towards her, something that she will carry on as the book series went on. So moving on, we have number 7. Now this is the one weird one for me because right now this one has to be on there. But if we go off of what I think will happen in Winds of Winter, it doesn't make any sense for it to be in the top 10 in my opinion. So this is going to be Jon Snow. So Jon Snow for me right now, I think is going to be revived one way or another in Winds of Winter. I've made those videos before. I think it'll be kind of through Ghost. Similar to where there's a theory that Robb, when he died, actually went into Grey Wind and then died again. So that's kind of what I think is happening with Jon. I think his consciousness goes into Ghost, and then eventually that we kind of put back into his body. But Jon is, for one, the Lord Commander. He is the one trying to unite everyone, for one. And the other big part is, if you were like someone like me who thinks, you know, he's Rhaegar and Lyanna's son, him dying is huge because he's a legit Stark. He is a legit Targaryen and the heir to the throne at this point, unless Aegon is actually who he is, or young Griff is who he is. Then this death is hugely impactful when it comes to that. The emotional effect in this scene is much different than it is in the show. The books, people are crying. You can tell that this is a very difficult decision, something that people didn't want to do, but they believed genuinely that this was in their best interest, that Jon was destroying the wall and he was going to get everyone killed. It's a very emotional chapter with Jon, and it's tough not to put him in the top 10 because it really has the culmination of being a very impactful kill as well as a very emotional death as well. So, getting into our top 6. Number 6 is going to be Joffrey. So Joffrey, to me, is the main villain of the entire series. I'd say he's the most hated. I would say Tywin is really probably the main villain. But Joffrey, to me, is kind of the face of the people the reason we hate the Lannisters, right? Joffrey's kind of the face of that. He's a dickhead. And Joffrey, he is a very awesome death because it's so brutal in the books and it's so alarming that you almost kind of feel bad and feel sympathy for Joffrey for a second. If you're someone like me, every time I read that scene, or I'm just like waiting for Joffrey to die, but when you get there, you're in Tyrion's mind as well, and even Tyrion kind of has pause, like this is actually very violent. So Joffrey has the emotional effect of 3 books of just wanting Joffrey to die, right? You have the foreshadowing, the build-up. Joffrey is a character that it's the most satisfying of the entire book series when he dies. And the ripple effects and after effects that leave when Joffrey dies, think about it, right? You have a new king coming onto the Iron Throne. You have the fallout of that, Tyrion being accused. Tyrion, then everything that goes on with King's Landing for the rest of Storm of Swords, with Tywin dying and all that. Hugely impactful, hugely emotional. It has to be within that top 10. So, moving on to number 5. Now, I think number 5 and number 6 you could very easily switch, but I think because of the spectacle in number 5 and the emotional weight that you feel with number 5, I think Oberyn deserves to be above Joffrey and break into that top 5. Because because Oberyn dies in this trial, and let's even paint a scene. I love doing this chapter. I did a chapter analysis on this chapter, but the entire chapter, you feel this unease, and there's foreshadowing that things are probably not going to go well here. Tyrion feels it, but George finds a way to kind of make us feel like, oh my, Oberyn's actually going to win this. And it gets to the point where the Mountain is all but beaten, right? And we're sitting here going, this is wonderful. Tyrion's going to get out of here. They've already, foreshadowed that Tyrion's going to go with Oberyn to Dorne. One of our main characters isn't going to die. And you see one of the fan favorite characters in the book series, in the matter of literally like 2 paragraphs, his head gets squished, pushed in, his whole guts, his brain is splattered on the cement. And you're sitting here going, not only did we just lose Oberyn, who is a fantastic character in his own right, but now Tyrion is sentenced to die. Now, I know Tyrion gets out of it and all that, but the emotional weight that you feel when Oberyn dies and that trial of combat goes the way it does, along with the pure impact that has. Oberyn's death leads to an entire plotline with the Dornish in the next book. It has ripple effects everywhere. Tyrion, then, not because he's free, kills his father. Tyrion's whole arc stems from this event and also Joffrey's death. So Oberyn and Joffrey are kind of very tied together for me to where they're pretty much switchable for me. But I personally, because of the way Oberyn goes out and the pure just shock value, and it's not something out of left field, right? It's kind of hinted at, right? George subtly gives us foreshadowing that this is very possible, and it's been hinted at the entire time. One wrong move against the Mountain, and it's over. There's no, back steps or whatever. There's no coming back. One misstep and you're fucked. So I think very good death. And now the top 4. So the top 4, in my opinion, you can really rearrange these in any order. I have personal bias on 1 and 2, but I ranked the top 4 as best as I could. Now, number 4 is Ned. You guys might be surprised that he's this low, but I think Ned, to me, the main character of book 1, if you're like me and I watched the show first, you were really sitting there the entire time, right? And George really loves to do this. He loves to give you that outlook that there is a good going to happen. There's something good is going to happen. And it's something that is very reminiscent to life, right? When something bad happens in your life, you get some bad news, someone gets cancer, right? You're sitting there and the odds may look bad. Your survival rate may look bad, but in your mind, you're thinking, I'm going to beat this, maybe everything's going to be okay and we're going to get past this. And that's just sometimes not how life goes. And George loves to do this. He does this for the Red Wedding. He does this for Ned's death. The whole time we're thinking Ned's going to go to the Watch. He's going to meet up with Jon. It's not going to go so bad, right? And when Joffrey even says, bring me his head, we're sitting there thinking, okay, someone's going to stop this. The pure emotional just conflict going on as Ned dies and loses his head is something that I will never forget, because it was really the first death or the first scene that I feel like when I was growing up that genuinely shook me, right? Because when you think about this is the death that really starts the entire franchise, which is really the reason I think you could put it 1, 2, 3, or 4 or higher. I think Ned has to be in your top 4 at the very least. It starts the entire conflict, really, of the next, really, of all the books. It is a death that holds so much emotional weight and impact that it deserves to be this high, in my opinion. But yeah. Moving on, we have number 3. This is going to be Tywin's death, another big hitter, big death. Tywin's death is really the entire reason the Lannister dynasty falls apart. We see that Tywin, his entire life, has kind of been building towards this Lannister dynasty, and he's been gaining power as he's grown up and as he's gotten older. And Tywin's death really shows how incapable his children were outside of Tyrion of ruling. I mean, and you see how quickly things fall apart. And then the sheer emotional value of Tyrion killing Tywin. It is built up really from, I think, the ending or the back half of book 1 with Tyrion and Tywin, and how that they interact. There's always been this unease between the two and this almost hatred, right? Definitely from Tywin's side, hatred of Tyrion. And it kind of comes to a head where Tyrion realizes that Tywin has sentenced his own son to die, even when Tywin probably knew it wasn't Tyrion. It's the culmination of figuring out that Tysha, all of that was a lie. It is sure the emotional weight that is built up within the last few chapters with Tyrion, with Shay also betraying Tyrion and going with Tywin. It is just the emotional weight of Tywin's death with Tyrion. And Tywin's not a character I think that most people like. He's a character that we all know is a great character, but Tywin is the king who never was the king, and his impact is felt throughout the next 2 books, and it's going to even be felt in Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring as well, as we see the fall probably of House Lannister outside of maybe Tyrion. But definitely a great death. The way Tywin goes out, where it's completely against Tywin's really nature, this persona he's built up, dying on the toilet, an arrow through his bowels, basically. It is, and the way that the scene is ended with basically saying Tywin did not shit gold, it is a perfect death and the perfect ending to the Tywin and Tyrion kind of story, and it doesn't really end, right? It continues on. Is it something that kind of always sticks in Tyrion's mind? But that is number 3. So number 2 and number 1, we're going to talk about as a joint one, because they are really the same event, just with different characters. Robb and Catelyn, or kind of the Red Wedding as a whole, is 1 and 2. And I have Catelyn at 2 and Robb at 1. So not only is this more shocking, in my opinion, than Ned's death, if you just look at the internet, right? This is a perfect sign of the thousands of reaction videos of the Red Wedding. The Red Wedding is something that, to me, it's never going to be topped, I don't think, ever again in history, on the most shocking death of killing of main characters ever. It is the perfect foreshadowing and pacing, right? Because not only do I love the Red Wedding, and it is my favorite chapter within the book series, which is, I think, something we're going to end up doing on this channel, and revisiting kind of my top 10 favorite chapters. If you look at the Catelyn chapter before the Red Wedding and also the Arya chapter before the Red Wedding, the entire atmosphere is painted through those few chapters. Something that that is talked about with Marvel so much when you look at the Infinity War saga is how everything built toward the next, right? And that's how those chapters felt. They painted the picture and they gave you the mood and the theme going into the Red Wedding. Right, and the Red Wedding is something that, again, we look at, Ned, where Robb has this elaborate plan. He's going to go north. He's going to take back the north. And we're sitting here thinking, okay, all is well and good. But then in the back of our minds, and even in Catelyn's, right, we're right there with Catelyn. This whole wedding feels off. And Catelyn herself says, we just got to make it through this wedding, and I'm more worried about this wedding than I am with Robb and battle. Which is a crazy statement to make when you think about the odds of dying in a battle towards a wedding. Right now, in this universe, dying at a wedding happens all the damn time. But it is amazing the way George can make that feeling of unease and make your stomach almost turn when you realize what's about to happen. And it's something I think the show does a fantastic job of painting from the books, is kind of the mood and how, when you see Catelyn's face, when she figures it out and you're inside her head, it is genuinely the most impactful event Think about it. The Red Wedding is an event that just shakes all of Westeros. It is something that we hear every single character talk about in some regard or another. It takes the Tullys out of power. It takes the Starks out of power. 2 of the 7 kingdoms are almost completely erased after this event. I know that there's, again, people in other places, but to the general public, they're wiped out. The Red Wedding is still felt in Winds of Winter, right? I just made a video last week talking about, will there be another Red Wedding? It is just a perfect piece of writing from George. It is so much perfect to me that it shows me that when I get to the Red Wedding, the chapter of the Red Wedding, I take a certain time out of my day or my week when I get to rereadings to do that chapter because it genuinely depresses me. So now let's talk about why I actually ranked Catelyn at 2 and Robb at 1. I think Catelyn at 2 for me, she goes out pretty roughly. She basically gets her throat pretty much cut. But I think Robb's, to me, is more emotional than Catelyn's, which is the only reason I put it higher, because Robb's, it's just the Jaime Lannister sends his regards is a tough line. Seeing Robb die right in Catelyn's mind, right in front of us, it hurts so much. And, like, I genuinely think it is the best piece of writing I've ever read. And as much as I say the Red Wedding is something that is very depressive and it's hard to read at times, it is still my favorite chapter. So that is the video. Let me know what you guys think. What do you guys think about my top 4 specifically? Where would you rank Robb, Catelyn, Tywin, and Ned? I personally am just a sucker for the Red Wedding. I think a lot of you guys know that. But that is my top 10. Let me know if I missed anybody, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye, guys.
If you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention.